In the second half of the 18th century, a series of political disagreements and increased exploitation of the North American colonies by the metropolis led to armed rebellion. The first clash took place at Lexington and Concord. After the battle, British troops returned to Boston, which was later besieged by a 15,000-strong army of colonists. The British garrison commanded by Thomas Gage was small in number and could not resist the enemy in open battle. The general decided to wait for reinforcements from England and then counterattack the enemy to seize the initiative and drive the rebels away from the city. Boston was situated on a peninsula with a narrow isthmus. On the north and south lay the hills, from which there was a fine view of the city and harbour, and by placing artillery on the high ground it was possible to fire accurately on the fortifications and ships in the harbour, preventing the delivery of supplies by sea. General Gage, fearing a rebellion in the city, withdrew troops from the heights to reinforce the garrison of Boston. This did not make much difference as the militia had no serious artillery, but the situation changed when the colonists in May 1775 managed to take Fort Ticonderoga, which contained a large number of powerful guns and a large supply of ammunition. The rebels immediately sent cannon to Boston. At the end of May, the British garrison finally received the long-awaited reinforcements, consisting of 3 infantry regiments, a regiment of light dragoons, a battalion of marines and several artillery batteries, with the arrival of Generals William Howe, John Burgoyne and Henry Clinton. The garrison grew to 6,000 men, and the British commander, Thomas Gage, decided that the time had come for decisive action. An offensive plan was drawn up, according to which on 18th of June the troops were to seize the dominant heights in the south and attack Roxbury, then take Bunker Hill and advance on Cambridge from 2 sides. The rebels quickly learnt of the enemy's plans, and the Massachusetts Provincial Congress instructed General Ward to take Bunker Hill, which was located on the Charleston Peninsula. The peninsula was connected to the mainland by a narrow isthmus about 100 metres wide. In the south was the town of Charleston, separated from Boston by a 500-metre strait. There were 3 elevations on the peninsula: Morton Hill, Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. Fields of tall vegetation were crossed by wooden and stone fences. On 16th June, Colonel William Prescott led a force of several regiments, totalling 1,200 men, to the Charleston Peninsula, supported by a battery of 4 guns under Colonel Gridley. After the soldiers crossed the isthmus, Prescott told the regimental commanders about the mission. A dispute arose between the officers as to which hill to take. Bunker Hill was the highest and had a fortification erected earlier by the British, but the height was too far from Boston. Breed's Hill was much closer to the city but had no fortifications. The dispute lasted about an hour, and eventually Prescott made a compromise decision. He ordered to build a fortification on Breed's Hill, and in case of failure to withdraw to Bunker Hill. Around midnight the colonists moved forward. One company of Prescott's regiment, commanded by Captain Robert Muxwell, was ordered to send patrols to the southern part of the town, in the area of the ferry crossing, and to keep an eye on the movement of the British. The squad's engineer, Colonel Gridley, marked out a 40 by 40 metre square with a narrow passage to the north. At midnight the soldiers received picks and shovels and began to build the fortifications. Although the colonists were careful not to make any noise, the British general, Sir Henry Clinton, who was reconnoitring at the time, heard the clatter of shovels and reported to Gage. Clinton proposed to immediately gather troops and attack the enemy at dawn, but General Gage decided to wait until sunrise and then, after finding out what the enemy is planning, to decide on further action. At 4:35 a.m, the crew aboard the Lively spotted the fortification and opened fire. Woken by the cannonade, Admiral Greaves demanded a halt to the firing, but General Gage ordered the bombardment to continue and sent out instructions to other ships to join the attack. As dawn broke, Prescott inspected the redoubt and noticed that the fortification could be outflanked. The soldiers, also noticing the vulnerability of their position, began to hesitate and suspect the command of treachery. Their hesitation was reinforced when colonist Esser Pollard had his head blown off by a cannonball, an episode that shocked the untrained soldiers. To give the men courage, Prescott climbed the redoubt and walked at a leisurely pace around the fortification, ignoring the flying cannonballs. The tired colonists were downcast. The men were thirsty from the June sun, and one of the cannonballs hit a water barrel, depriving the soldiers of drinking water. The officer suggested that Prescott send a message to headquarters, asking them to replace the tired militia, but the colonel refused, believing that the soldiers who had built the fortification would be more willing to defend it. At this time, General Gage called the senior officers to a meeting. Sir Henry Clinton proposed to immediately gather 500 men and land them on the isthmus, cutting off the enemy's supply lines. Then they could attack the colonists from the rear or wait for the enemy, weakened by starvation, to lay down their arms. Clinton believed that it was necessary to act quickly without delay, before the enemy has not finished building fortifications. Otherwise, it will have to attack well-equipped positions, which is fraught with heavy losses. Howe and Burgoyne opposed, pointing to the excessive complexity of landing on the coast occupied by the enemy. The generals feared that even in the case of a successful landing of a small British detachment will be squeezed between the large enemy compounds. The generals did not know how many militia were on the peninsula, and the mainland besides the British ships manoeuvring off the coast could sit on the shoal. Sir William argued that after the retreat from Concord, the British troops should prove their superiority in open combat over the undertrained rebels, and eventually it was decided to land in two places, on the eastern edge of the peninsula and in the south, close to the town where the fleet could easily cover the landing. Once the troops were ashore, a squad of light infantry would march along the shore and attack the redoubt from the rear, pinning down the enemy with fire. After this, the Symmetry, which had a shallow draft, would come closer to the shore and open fire on the redoubt, later joined in the bombardment by the 24-pounder guns located on Cop Hill. The light 6-pounder guns that had crossed with the infantry would then move forward and open fire, suppressing the enemy and preventing the colonists from taking aim, at which time the British infantry would approach the fortification and attack at bayonets. The operation was to involve 2,200 infantry and 100 artillerymen. At this point, this force was vastly outnumbered by the rebel force of about 600 men. Many of the militia had withdrawn to safer shelter on Bunker Hill. Some deserted, unable to withstand the bombardment. Those who remained were ordered to extend the line of fortifications towards the east bank. General Putnam personally went to headquarters to ask for reinforcements. He was fortunate to secure the support of Richard Davis, an influential man who favoured a decisive battle with the enemy, and Richard ordered several New Hampshire companies, the Connecticut Regiment and 9 Massachusetts regiments, to be sent to the peninsula, totalling about 6,000 men. At 1 p.m, 28 barges filled with soldiers in red uniforms headed for the Charleston Peninsula. As soon as the ships approached the landing sites, the warships opened fire. The Falcon and Lively bombarded the area in front of Breed's Hill to neutralise any enemy forces that might interfere with the landing. The Somerset, 2 floating batteries and a battery on Copp's Hill, opened fire on the redoubt. The Glasgow and Symmetry shelled the isthmus. The redoubt suffered little damage. The ships could not raise their guns high enough, and the battery of 24-pounder guns was too far away to aim. 30 minutes after the bombardment began, the first soldiers went ashore. Then the barges returned for the second group. At this time, Howe reconnoitred the enemy positions and discovered that the colonists had built new fortifications to cover their flanks. The general decided to postpone the attack until the approach of all units. At 3 p.m, the second group landed on the shore. By this time, 5 Massachusetts regiments approached the isthmus and under fire of enemy ships without losses passed to the peninsula. The hastily assembled rebel army was not distinguished by high morale and discipline. The artillery officers, Captain Samuel Gridley and John Callender, decided to remove the guns from their positions. General Putnam noticed the precious cannons had gone to the rear and demanded an explanation from the gunners. Not receiving a satisfactory answer, he ordered them to return to their positions immediately. The officers reluctantly agreed, but as soon as the general was out of sight, the gunners immediately abandoned their guns and fled to the rear. While the British waited for the rest of the regiments to cross the strait, the militia continued to fortify their positions. Reinforcements began to arrive. The first to arrive were James Reed's and John Stark's New Hampshire regiments. Putnam immediately sent them to the left flank, which was covered by a Connecticut detachment of 200 men under Captain Bolton. The New Hampshires took up positions in an old ditch behind a fence, which they reinforced by piling wooden fences on top. At this time, the second part of the British detachment landed, bringing the total number of British troops on the peninsula to 2,200. Howe moved forward 4 companies of light infantry to cover the deployment of the main force. At this point, the colonists were numerically inferior to the enemy. Formerly under Prescott's command, there were 5,000, 6,000 militiamen, but only 900 were in position. 115 men from the 18th and 22nd Massachusetts regiments occupied the outskirts of the town. About 150 militiamen of the 9th Massachusetts Regiment were in the redoubt, 200 rebels were sheltering in the ditch, and about 400 soldiers took position behind a wooden fence. A large number of rebels remained on Bunker Hill, and according to eyewitness accounts, the rear of the army was in chaos, with many of the militia scattered around the peninsula not knowing what to do, and attempts to restore order were futile, with soldiers and officers disobeying orders or pretending not to understand. Meanwhile, the British regiments lined up for the attack. General Howe, having examined the enemy's positions, decided to use the narrow beach located in the low ground to bypass the enemy's left flank. Howe mistakenly believed that the militia had not erected fortifications in this place. 10 companies of light infantry were to line up in column and using the low ground to bypass the enemy's defences along the riverbank. At this time, 10 grenadier companies with 4 light guns would divert the enemy's attention from the front. General Piggott was to conduct a diversionary attack on the redoubt without allowing the enemy to move reserves to the left flank. Once the colonists were pinned down on both sides, the grenadiers and light infantry, supported by fusiliers from the 5th and 52nd Regiments, would strike at bayonets and complete the defeat of the enemy's left flank. At the same time, General Piggott's 38 infantry companies would bypass Breed's Hill and attack the redoubt from the flank, supported by 6-pounder guns that would fire suppressive fire. After 3 p.m, the 12-pounder guns mounted on Molten Point opened fire, then the British infantry and 6-pounder guns moved forward, at which point the battery commander decided to check the ammunition and found that the ammunition boxes contained 12-pounders instead of 6-pounders. As a result, the support of the light artillery, which was an important part of the plan, had to be eliminated. The second factor that had a serious effect on the battle was the underestimation of the enemy. General Howe thinking that the colonists would not build a fortification on a narrow beach in the lowlands. The shoreline could only accommodate 15 men in a row, and when a company of Royal Fusiliers approached the stone wall at a distance of about 30 metres, the colonists, who had taken cover behind the barricade, fired 2 volleys at close range to sweep the enemy off the beach. Then a company of the 4th Infantry Regiment came forward. The captain thought the enemy would not have time to reload their muskets, but there were more militia behind the wall than the British officers had realised, and again a volley was fired, after which 30 soldiers out of 35 fell to the ground. A company of the 10th Infantry Regiment attacked and was destroyed by the colonists with a volley from 10 metres. The British lost 3 elite companies but decided to continue the offensive. The column still had about 200 soldiers. Shocked by the massacre, the infantrymen of the 52nd Regiment hesitantly moved forward and soon were also destroyed by apt volleys from close range, followed by attacks of 6 more companies that ended in disaster. The beach was strewn with soldiers in red uniforms. Within 10 minutes, the British lost 96 men and several dozen were seriously wounded. At this time, 10 grenadier companies under the blazing sun were slowly moving forward. The soldiers had to overcome fences and small marshy areas, bypass abandoned stone kilns. All these obstacles prevented the infantry from keeping an even formation, which was important for the battles of the 18th century. Israel Putnam ordered Captain John Ford to drag 2 guns to a position behind a wooden fence. Putnam tried to fire at the enemy but probably loaded too much powder and the gun burst. Fortunately, the general was unhurt. The restless officer loaded the second gun with musket bullets. This time he succeeded. The giant shotgun spat out a bunch of improvised buckshot and hit the British infantry, hitting a large number of soldiers in red uniforms. Encouraged by the success, the general called in 3 soldiers and ordered them to continue firing at the enemy. The inexperienced colonists managed to fire a few shots, but then the gun broke. General Howe was leading the attack of the Grenadiers when he received a report of the destruction of a column of light infantry. Despite the fact that 2 important points of the plan were not fulfilled, he decided to continue the offensive and ordered all units to attack the enemy positions. So instead of complex manoeuvres under cover of artillery, British soldiers had to attack the fortifications head-on. When the Grenadiers approached the enemy at 100 metres, the most accurate militiamen opened fire, but General Putnam ordered them to stop firing and wait for orders. After allowing the British to come within 60 metres, the colonists opened fire. The Grenadiers stopped and returned fire, and then, bayonets out in front of them, moved forward at an accelerated pace. As the last hedge was crossed, the soldiers in red uniforms halted to level the ranks, and then the militia fired a heavy volley. When the smoke cleared, the colonists saw many of the British lying on the ground. The survivors ran back stunned by the accuracy of the enemy's fire. Companies of the 5th and 52nd Regiments then came on the attack and were also met by accurate fire at close range, killing a large number of soldiers and officers, the rest retreating in disorder. General Howe was lucky to survive the massacre, his headquarters being badly damaged, many officers being killed or wounded. The Grenadiers lost 80% of their personnel, with only half the soldiers and companies of the 5th and 52nd Regiments remaining in formation. Despite the failure on the right flank, Sir William Howe was still confident of victory. He believed that the attack on the left flank would succeed and the redoubt would be taken. 38 infantry companies led by General Piggott approached the outskirts of Charleston and came under fire from colonists occupying empty houses. Howe ordered Admiral Greaves to open fire on the town with the ship's guns. It didn't take long for the Royal Navy to rain a hail of red-hot cannonballs down on the city, causing numerous fires and destruction. The bombardment did little damage to the gunners, and they continued to fire on the British infantry. An annoyed Piggott ordered the Royal Marines to drive the colonists out of the town. The rebels defended themselves effectively by firing from windows and evading close combat. Having eliminated the threat from the flank, Piggott ordered companies of the 38th and 43rd Regiments to attack the redoubt from the east, while the 47th Regiment and the remnants of the Marines struck from the south. The attack was poorly coordinated and allowed the colonists to manoeuvre freely, concentrating units in threatening directions. Here the British suffered fewer casualties, but General Piggott, believing that he only needed to distract the enemy's attention, drew his troops back. Shocked by the failure and the heavy losses that the militia inflicted on the professional British army, General Howe abandoned the offensive along the coast and, gathering the remnants of light infantry and grenadiers, decided to strike again in the centre. General Piggott was ordered to repeat the attack on the redoubt. Regrouping, the elite units went forward again, stepping over the bodies of their fallen comrades. The colonists let the enemy at close range and swept away the British with accurate volleys at point-blank range. The surviving soldiers in disarray retreated to their original positions. Grenadiers and light infantry companies suffered heavy losses from 750 infantrymen, and the line remained only 300, many of whom were slightly wounded. The thinning companies of the 5th and 52nd Regiments lined up in battle order waiting for the signal to attack. Howe pointed his sword at the enemy fortifications, exclaimed, "Lads, once more, let's go again, show them what the English soldier can do." The British were again met by a wall of fire, and having suffered casualties, the soldiers fell back, unable to break through to the enemy. Howe, without a scratch, retreated with the defeated companies. He soon received a report that Piggott's attack had also ended in disaster, and the troops on the left flank had withdrawn with heavy losses. If at this point General Howe had decided to stop attacking and withdraw, the Battle of Bunker Hill could have ended like the Battle of New Orleans. At this point, the British had lost about 850 men, while the rebels had only a few dozen killed. Despite the losses, Howe was still confident he could defeat the undertrained militia. Despite requests from some officers to withdraw to Boston, the general sent a request to Gage to send reinforcements for another attack. The British generals at Cop Hill watched in amazement as the attacks of the well-trained British army were repeatedly repulsed by the hastily assembled colonist militia. General Clinton, irritated by the setbacks, decided to personally lead 800 soldiers of the 63rd Regiment and 2nd Battalion Marines into battle. Jumping into the first boat, he took the shortest route and ordered them to land at Charleston. The rebels were still in the settlement and opened accurate fire on the enemy. The boat in which the general was sitting was hit by a hail of bullets, killing several men. Despite opposition, the British soldiers successfully landed and pushed the colonists deeper into the town. Clinton noticed that a large number of wounded Englishmen had congregated near the shore and had come down in the hope of crossing to the other side of the river. The general asked them to take up arms and join the attack, and despite their fatigue and wounds, many agreed and got into line. On the right flank, Howe lined up his battered companies in preparation for the attack on the hill, this time with 6-pounder guns that had finally received suitable charges. The colonists anxiously watched the enemy's preparations. Ammunition was running low, and the fighting units had not been resupplied except for a small number of volunteers. The rebel command had been unable to force the numerous militia groups in the rear and the 25th Massachusetts Regiment occupying Bunker Hill to advance. At this point, the ratio of forces at Bridge Hill was 5-1 in favour of the British, with 200 militia facing 1,000 British, supported by 6-pound cannons. This time, the British decided not to disperse their forces and concentrate on the hill. Having lined up their troops in battle order, Generals Howe and Clinton gave the signal to attack. Again, the soldiers in red uniforms moved forward. The colonists let the enemy close to open fire, at first quite dense, but after a few minutes weakened due to lack of ammunition. The British soldiers quickly overcame the shot space and climbed the earthen rampart, overcoming the resistance of the colonists. Once inside the redoubt, the British quickly bayoneted the rebels who had not had time to retreat through the narrow passage. The rest retreated to Bunker Hill, with Colonel Gridley wounded in the retreat. The militia was saved from final defeat by the New Hampshires under Stark and Knowlton's Connecticut, who retreated in order. Attempts to establish a defence on Bunker Hill failed, and the militia, shocked by the retreat from Bridge Hill and shelling from the sea, began to leave the peninsula en masse. Colonel Thomas Gardner ordered his soldiers to take up positions at the foot of the hill in the hope of delaying the enemy, but he was soon killed and his regiment fell back under enemy pressure. The British, by a series of bayonet attacks, repulsed the scattered enemy units. At 5 p.m, occupied Bunker Hill, General Clinton called for further attacks in pursuit of the enemy to Cambridge. But General Howe, exhausted by the battle and impressed by the high casualties, decided to postpone further pursuit until the next day, believing that the demoralised rebels would flee home. The battle showed that the militia can successfully resist a professional army. The British lost 226 men killed and 828 wounded, especially heavy losses suffered by the command staff, about 100 officers out of service. The rebels lost 140 men killed and 271 wounded. The colonists retreated from the peninsula and established themselves on the continent in preparation for further battles.